Hi everyone, this is Pastor Laura from First United Methodist Church and welcome to Bible Bootcamp. Each week we're diving into a different book of scripture starting with Genesis. So far we've had Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua and Judges, and now we're on the book of Ruth. Normally we do an overview and then a deeper dive into one little piece of the book. We're not going to do that deeper dive today because Ruth is so short. It's only 4 chapters. So if you have 30 minutes, sit down and you can read the whole thing, and then you've got all of it. So Ruth begins by saying that this is taking place in the days when the judges judged. So this book is meant to be read alongside the book of Judges that we covered last week. And it's kind of in some ways an answer to that book. So Judges is a book that's about Israel's slide as a society down and down and down, and they're just kind of disintegrating. And here you have the book of Ruth, which is an example of faithfulness that can exist even in the midst of all of that chaos and degradation and everything that's happening in Judges. There's still faithful people out there. Another interesting contrast with the book of Judges, Judges is very concerned with Israel's identity. And so a lot of, Judges 5 especially talks about defining Israel's identity sort of in opposition to the other people around them. So they're not meant to intermarry with other peoples. They're meant to not worship other people's gods. And they're meant to root out these other people from the land, these people who are not Israelites, these other nations, root them out from the land, get rid of them. And that's kind of the book of Judges. But here we have a very different picture of that because Ruth is not an Israelite. Ruth is a Moabite. And it's interesting, you see the problem that causes in the book of Judges. Judges starts with, eliminate the outsider, which at first is the Canaanites. So these foreigners, the people who were originally in the land, Israel comes in and tries to get rid of them and defeat them in battle. But later, by the end of the book, the ones to get rid of become the tribe of Benjamin, which is a tribe of Israel. So Israel kind of turns in on itself, and that's a huge problem. And so Ruth is here kind of complicating that story in Judges that, Israel needs to focus on itself and get rid of these other people in the land. And Ruth is complicating that. So there's this question of, can the people of Israel live in the midst of other peoples and stay faithful to their covenant with God? And on the other hand, can they acknowledge that to some degree they are not just they are not just of one ethnicity as a people? Can they acknowledge that that there are other peoples among them contributing to them? Can they open their boundaries as a people and still be faithful? And the answer to that in the book of Ruth is yes, they can. That's a good question for us too, as Americans, as Christians. What does it mean? What does our identity mean? Can we acknowledge that that others can come in and we can still be faithful people? It's a good. Ruth is always brought up in conversations about immigration, that kind of thing, because it's a very relevant book for that. Ruth is an immigrant. So the book of Ruth opens with this lack of food, and to meet that lack of food, this family turns outward and they go to the land of Moab to find food. And this is Naomi, Elimelech, and their sons who are from Bethlehem. And Elimelech means my God is king. So this is Naomi's husband. My God is king. And remember, the question in Judges is the people are led by these judges. And by the end, there's this question of, well, maybe we need a king. And Elimelech, the name means my God is king. This acknowledgement that the people already have a king, and that king is God. So Moab, so Ruth is a Moabite. Ruth is the main character in this story. Ruth is the daughter-in-law of Naomi, who is an Israelite. So Naomi and Elimelech's 2 sons both marry foreigners. So Moab is a foreign nation from Israel, and Moab pops up a lot in Scripture, starting in Genesis. So Genesis 19, Moab is the son of Lot and Lot's daughter, which is kind of an awful story. But Moab is the son of that union, and Moab is a cousin of Jacob and Isaac, so major figures in Israel's heritage. So it's not a great start. It starts with this terrible story about Lot and his daughters, and that's how Moab comes to be. And then this nation of Moab comes from him. So Exodus 15 talks about Moab too. The Song of the Sea, after they've sort of defeated the Egyptians and gone out from Egypt, there's this song that talks about the leaders of Moab will tremble. The Israelites are going to challenge them. And then in Numbers 21, the Israelites move through the wilderness of Moab, and they take the land of the Moabites. And then in Numbers 29, there's a whole song against Moab. Israel's gonna defeat Moab, and all of Deuteronomy takes place on the plains of Moab, and it says that Moab is in great dread of Israel. So Numbers 25, it talks about how the Israelite men have children with the Moabite women and then sacrifice those kids just like the Moabites would. Not great. Moab is not great in the Israelite history. Moab is not portrayed very well, does not come across very well. In Judges chapter 3, the king of Moab, Eglon, has power over Israel. And so one of the judges is raised up to defeat Moab, and they kill the king of Moab. And it says that they struck down 10,000 Moabites, not one escaped. That day Moab was made subject to Israel. So Moab is the enemy all throughout the Old Testament so far. And now you have Ruth, who is a Moabite. So again, you have the children of Elimelech and Naomi marry Moabite women. The women are Orpah and Ruth. And Oprah was originally meant to be named after Orpah in the book of Ruth, but spelling kind of got messed up, and so she's Oprah instead of Orpah. The narrator doesn't judge this, even though that's kind of condemned earlier in Scripture, just marry other Israelites. But here it's kind of okay. And then the men die. And so these are Naomi's sons who die, and Naomi is devastated. She's this, they've gone to Moab to look for food. Naomi's this foreign woman here with no one to protect her. And so she tells her daughter-in-laws to go home. May the Lord make hesed, which is a word that means covenant loyalty. May the Lord be loyal, faithful to you, as the Lord has been with my sons and as you have been with me. So Naomi is saying that these Moabite women, these women of the enemy, have shown the same kind of loyalty and generosity to her as God shows to God's people, which is pretty high praise. So Orpah finally leaves, and she's not judged for that at all. But Ruth decides to cleave to Naomi, and the same word, devaka, that's the word that's used for husband and wife in Genesis. So this union, which is interesting because it shows that in Scripture there's a sense of a deep bond that can exist between friends, between other relationships besides just husband and wife, can have that bond of deep loyalty. And that'd be a good starting place for a theology of friendship. And then there's that commitment, these famous words that often pop up in wedding ceremonies. We had it in ours. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. Death will not separate us. And that's Ruth's words to Naomi, her mother-in-law. So Ruth stays with Naomi. They go back to Bethlehem, back to Naomi's homeland. And Naomi decides that she's no longer going to be Naomi. She's going to be Mara, which means bitter. And so in 1 Samuel, Hannah uses that word again. She is bitter, and we'll talk about that next week when we get into 1 Samuel. So they go to Bethlehem, and it is the barley harvest. So in chapter 2, Ruth offers to glean to provide for Naomi. So gleaning is the practice from Leviticus and Deuteronomy where farmers are told to leave any grain that gets left that is not harvested, that falls out, is to be left for the poor to come around and pick that up. So Ruth offers to do that, to go glean. So she does, and she meets Boaz. And Ruth, we're constantly reminded that Ruth is a Moabite. The other workers call her that frequently. But she's very faithful to Naomi. She works very hard to provide for her. And Boaz tells the other workers not to harm her. And that's a reminder, you go back to Judges, and this is not a safe time, especially for women. There's a lot of violence against women in the book of Judges. And Boaz knows that. And so he stands up and tries to protect Ruth from that. In the book of Judges, you have lots of stories of violence against women, but there's one where women are abducted in the fields to be wives for Benjamin, so that could happen. And Boaz is trying to not let that happen. And so Ruth asks him, "Why have I, a foreigner, found favor in your eyes?" And Boaz's answer is again that word hesed, because of your hesed, because of your devotion and your loyalty, and he sees that in her. And so he gives them food, and there's a lot of it. There's leftovers. And Naomi gets that gift from Boaz and praises God's hesed, so God's loyalty, faithfulness. So it's interesting that human faithfulness, human loyalty, human goodness is a way here that God shows God's faithfulness. It's by Ruth's hands that God is acting and that God is being faithful to Naomi and Ruth. So in chapter 3, Naomi instructs Ruth in how to get closer to Boaz, and she does. Boaz praises her resourcefulness and her self-sufficiency. And in chapter 4, they get married. The whole community witnesses this. May the Lord make this woman like Rachel and Leah, who built up the house of Israel. So they're praying that Ruth will be one of them. So this is a big deal. This foreign woman is accepted and will become one of these women. And you go back to Genesis and God's promise that the descendants of Abraham, that through them, God will bless all the nations. And so here's kind of an example of that, except kind of in reverse. Through Ruth, the foreigner, God is blessing this nation of Israel. So Ruth has a son, and this is kind of the start of a new life for Naomi, and she becomes joyful again. She's more aware of God's gift of life, and she's very happy to have a grandson. And so it's interesting, it says in Ruth chapter 4 that the women of the community named Ruth's son. So everyone came together and gave him a name, and the name is Obed. And so Obed is going to father Jesse, and Jesse will father David, so King David. So this is really important. So it ends with a genealogy. The genealogy starts with Perez. Perez was the child of Tamar and Judah from Genesis. Again, not a great story. And then the genealogy runs through Ruth and Boaz's son Obed, the father of Jesse, the father of King David. And then in Matthew chapter 1 in the Gospels, that gets picked up again as part of Joseph's genealogy. So Joseph, the father of Jesus, has Ruth and Ruth's son in his lineage. So there's this, even with Jesus, even with King David, these major figures, these really important people, and God's son, there's foreign blood there, and that foreign blood is celebrated. And that's a really important thread going all through the Old Testament. Even as Israel is told to remember who they are, to keep their identity as God's people, there's always this thread of how they are blessed by others, how outsiders bless them, how they bless outsiders. They're never sort of shut doors totally. Ruth is an example that commitment and loyalty are possible, that ordinary people can kind of imitate God and God's faithfulness, that word hesed, that we can be hesed to each other. And through our hesed, people can see God's hesed, God's faithfulness, and that as we sustain each other and promote life for each other. So thank you for listening. And next week we will talk about 1 Samuel.